going until no later than 6 p.m. If that's not going to be too late for you folks to get in your automobiles and skid home. Without hearing any opposition to that proposal,
Dr. Roquan, 5:30.
he always wants to negotiate. He's an attorney. Secretly. Secretly.
He's a doctor, he'll be late.
Okay. I believe we're going to go issue by issue at this time. And the first issue has to do with large UMA facility definition. Having said that, then we begin with the staff presentation on what they think that is. And then we'll have some other groups weigh in on that. Is that right, Madam Hearing Officer?
Yes, sir.
So, Director Lepore, whenever you are ready.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think I'm ready. I think it's afternoon, and here we go. The first issue is, how large is large? What constitutes a large oil and gas facility, particularly when that facility is to be located in an urban mitigation area? You've heard some conversation today about urban mitigation areas, the definitions, et cetera. Task Force Recommendation 17, I think, was very clear that the intent was to create a process for large facilities in the urban mitigation area as defined in the COGCC rules. So the staff has not proposed in any way altering the definition of an urban mitigation area, and have held no stakeholder processes around that definition. I think all of you are familiar with the definition, but I'll recite it here. An urban mitigation area is an area where there are at least 22 building units or one high occupancy building unit, either existing or under construction within a 1,000-foot radius of a proposed oil and gas location. Or you can take half of that radius, a semicircle of 1,000 feet, and have 11 building units or one high occupancy building and still be an urban mitigation area. That definition came from the U.S. Census Bureau's definition of what constitutes an urban area. We cut it in half. That is, we halved the density of a consensus of the census definition. So we're a bit more conservative. So in defining this, the staff had to come up with some metrics. And before we came up with the metrics, we wanted to come up with, what should those metrics do for us? What they needed to do, we felt, were to be objective, quantifiable, not just qualitative. Objective, easy to verify. We wanted them to be easy to identify early in the permitting process or the planning process, not subject to estimates, and not something we would know only after production actually began. And we wanted them to be kind of serve multi-purposes, do double duty, as it were. As we thought about metrics, we realized that if you're talking about production volume, that relates in other ways to other metrics like the emissions that might flow from that kind of volume or the truck traffic that volume might generate. So we realized there's some overlap. We wanted to pick metrics that had sort of the most overlap relative to the other ones. We wanted metrics that did correlate closely with impacts. One of the things that came up as we went around the state and talked to stakeholders was that they wanted metrics that dealt with impacts, and we understand that, but impacts can be more difficult to measure. They may not be known until we get into production, but we can look at things we think like the number of wells or like the feet of well bore and say that's going to relate closely to these other impacts. And then we wanted metrics that were flexible enough to apply to both vertical and horizontal wells and to oil and gas wells. The task force recommendation does not distinguish between those. It applies to all as far as we were concerned. We considered a lot of metrics, and you know, starting from early on in this process, after we knew what the task force recommendations were, understanding that we would be asked to define this both internally and again as we went around the state and talked. So there's a long list of things that we did consider before we arrived at the two that we ultimately selected. And we did consider the matrix, and several folks have talked about a matrix. We considered the matrix very early on, and we came to the same conclusion that Mr. Busher did, that it just sort of gets too complicated too fast, and that your bang for the buck we felt we could get with a little bit simpler metric. So with that, we came to these two metrics. The two metrics for defining a large urban mitigation area facility that staff is proposing are: one, the cumulative total measured depth of all new wells on a proposed location. So by total measured depth, we mean from the surface to the very bottom or the very end of that well. Cumulative, we mean add up all the wells on the proposed location. New, we mean wells that get drilled on this particular go-around, so you don't count existing wells. We think that metric gives us that flexibility that we talked about. We think it's a great surrogate for other things that matter. How many truck trips, how much production, how much emissions. We think that that metric captures the most of all of those other metrics. If there's a flaw to the metric, I think it's that it's maybe not intuitive for people to understand. What does, I'll use the number that we have sort of put out as a marker, 90,000 feet. What the heck is 90,000 feet of well bore? It's easier if you just say to somebody 8 wells. We get that, but 8 wells doesn't tell me whether you're talking about 1 mile laterals or 2 mile laterals or vertical wells, and that matters. That's a big difference. 8 vertical wells and 8 2-mile laterals are different beasts. So 90,000 feet, we think we can translate that. We think people will get used to it. We've translated it here for you, and we'll go into it a little bit. And I also want to say that I don't, the ultimate number is your decision. Whether it's 90,000 feet or half of that, as some people have proposed, or nearly double that, as others have proposed, is a decision that the 9 of you get to make. The other metric, and these are either or, doesn't have to be both, either one, is the total cumulative new and existing on-site storage capacity for produced hydrocarbons. All right, I'll break it down again. We're talking about oil storage on-site 99% of the time, because the other produced hydrocarbon gas gets put in a pipe, not stored on-site. We are not talking about produced water. I can explain why in a moment. So we're talking about what is the volume of oil that is planned to be stored on site. Again, this metric covers other things that concern people: truck traffic, emissions, visual impacts. It pertains to the production phase more so than the drilling phase, right? Once the wells are drilled, they're there, the trucks go away, the noise goes away, the lights go away, the wells are still there, but the wells aren't such a concern. On the production side, those tanks will be there and they will be used for the life of the production of the well. The potential for emissions is there for the life of the production of the well. The truck traffic to service those is there for the life of the well. So we've got a metric on the drilling side, we've got a metric on the production side.
So would you entertain questions as you go along? Would you prefer to wait until the conclusion of your presentation?
Mr. Chairman, I am the government and I am here to help. So whatever is your pleasure.
You are saying this is either or, total well length or storage capacity.
Yes, sir.
And that would mean then that would come into your purview to make a decision about which metric to use.
It means that when an operator, and this is sort of an interesting point, because of the obligation that we anticipate this rule will contain for the operator proposing such a facility to confer with the local government well before they submit their Form 2A to us, these metrics are things the operators have to look at and say, aha, we are going to be greater than X thousand feet of wellbore or greater than X thousand feet of storage capacity. We know that. We're planning this location. We're developing 160 acres or 320 or 640. We know what we're going to need. We're going to be over these metrics. That triggers this consultation process. And it's either the storage or the wellbore that triggers the requirement.
Thank you.
Thank you. And while I'm on that point, I'll just say now, and it's been said, but it is a very important point to understand. What this large facility definition does is trigger the consultation process. There are some mitigation measures that we'll talk about probably tomorrow that go along with this. What this does not do is set a limit on the number of wells, the feet of wellbore, the storage tank capacity. There are no limits set by what this is. This is a trigger for consultation.
Commissioner Benton, I believe.
So would it be safe to assume that when you trigger that consultation process, the length of time you would spend on that location would be part of that process before you start the 2A? Is that an appropriate understanding of this?
Commissioner, I'm going to have to ask me one more time. When you trigger the process,
Then part of that, you're going to be discussing how many wells you're going to drill, how long it's going to take to drill those wells, complete those wells. So how long you expect to be on the location. That's part of that consultation process.
yes, certainly, arguably, yes. I mean, I think the consultation process that we envision is hopefully a robust one with the local government that you heard Mr. Gruber from Erie say, Erie has negotiated an agreement with with Encana at several locations. Maybe that has already happened and there's, we're going to bypass this as we'll talk about as we go forward. But yes, and we would evaluate that as well when it gets to us on the Form 2A. But the discussion with the local government, one assumes, includes things like duration of drilling, size of the facility that you're going to build, and so forth. Was that responsive? I feel like it wasn't.
Like you said, you're the government.
Touche. Okay, I'm going to go right on then. So those are the two metrics we proposed. We put the following numbers in here as placeholders for discussion, 90,000 feet of wellbore. That number, as you'll see in a minute, equates to approximately 8 one-mile lateral horizontal wells drilled in the Niobrara or Codell. So understand, for those formations, we're going down 7,000 feet plus or minus a few hundred and out 4,300-ish feet for a 1 mile lateral. We've got lots of data on wellbore lengths that's been provided to you. So it's a plus or minus 8 1 mile horizontals. And the storage capacity, we put 4,000 barrels. 4,000 barrels is roughly equivalent to 8 500-barrel tanks. And you've seen some pictures of tanks, and we have some pictures of our own, or 13 300-barrel tanks. So those are the two standard oil tank sizes at locations in Colorado, roughly 8 of those, 13. That's enough storage capacity for about 4 1 mile laterals. So that's the lower threshold. And we did that on purpose to encourage, to incentivize operators to use pipelines to transport oil from facilities in urban mitigation areas, right? We want to encourage the use of pipelines. So, well, enough said, I'll leave it at that. But that's why the threshold for the storage tanks is quite a bit lower as we've proposed it than it is for the wells themselves. I'm just going to pause, I think, and tell you, what you've already read and know. There are lots of alternatives proposed to the quantities here. So the ones that we've seen the most reduce the wellbore length to 75,000 feet. That was proposed by Erie and the Northwest Colorado Council of Governments. Several stakeholders, local governments and citizen groups have proposed 45,000 feet as the wellbore length, which would get you about 4 1-mile laterals. And they also proposed reducing the storage capacity by half of what staff has proposed. I should have talked a little bit more. I did talk a little bit about the new wells. On storage capacity, we thought that the right metric was to add up together the existing storage capacity and the new storage capacity. The reason is that, again, those things are there for the life of the producing facility, and the potential impacts associated with those accumulate with each new one you put on. Unlike drilling, the drilling impacts are while you're drilling and while you're completing, for the most part. Then they're done. The tank is going to sit there and have all those potential impacts, even though it was there already. So that's why we think using cumulative, both new and used tanks is appropriate. So there were those stakeholders. What got me to that point is that there were stakeholders who want us to count new and existing wells as well. So, and I'll let them explain their reasoning, but I just want you to know that that's kind of out there. Industry would like bigger numbers, and they would actually not like to use wellbore length. They would like to use the number of wells. They've proposed 16 new vertical or directional wells or 12 horizontal wells. But again, they don't differentiate between 1-mile laterals and 2-mile laterals. I think that's a fatal flaw in their proposal. And then they want to a little bit more than double our storage tank capacity. They want 96,000 barrels of storage tank capacity, and they want those numbers to increase if you have secured, let me see if I get this right, secured pipeline transportation as of the date of first production for the produced hydrocarbons. That one runs afoul of one of our kind of metric rules, which is we're not going to know that until the date of first production. So how do you figure that out? And I'll let them answer that. But I think that's complicated because we have to wait until really you turn the thing on. And what we're trying to do here is figure this out months before you go to production. All right, that is terrific. You can't read it at all. Mr. Benton.
And you may have the answer to this. I might have missed it. I was just curious about when you looked at that, the 16 wells, sort of the length of time spent drilling and completing, say, 8 1-mile wells versus 8 2-mile wells. That was sort of a factor in that decision to get to the feet as opposed to well count.
So I'm sorry, I scrolled through the slides to see that we have provided to you some data on length of time to drill various length wells. I don't want to try to recite it
I'll go look it up
from memory. It's roughly 12 days to drill and complete a 1-mile lateral, and I want to say 17 for a 2-mile. Might be a little bit more than that. Maybe Stuart will come to my rescue.
I think it's, yeah, you're right. I got the data. Never mind. Scratch that question.
So it's not double the drilling time. Obviously, the 7,000 feet is still the 7,000 feet, but it's longer.
When you're talking, the question about storage, is that considered to be 4,000 barrels of permanent storage?
Define permanent.
30 years of, they're there for the life of the well, as opposed to I'm setting a certain number of tanks, and I know I'm going to have to eventually going to truck, and I'm going to convert this from a truck to a pipeline once the pipeline gets there, and then I pick up the tanks.
So again, we're trying to be able to ascertain this months before we go on production. And we want to do it for planning purposes, and we need to know so we know whether we trigger it and need to consult. So I would say, for example, flowback tanks, we know that's not permanent. We know that's for flush production, flowback, we're not counting those. If you're moving a 300 or 500 barrel tank onto the site with some plan someday down the road to take it off when the decline curve kicks in, we want to know the number of tanks you're going to put on there for your first month of production. That's what we would count.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm sorry this is probably illegible to most of you. Again, you have it. This was an analysis of wellbore length that staff did looking at multi-well sites, locations with between 3 and 9 wells on them and counting the cumulative wellbore length of those multi-well locations. The highlighted rows tell you the number of wells you will get in there on a location given a certain, so whatever the metric is you ultimately choose or the length that you ultimately choose. So I'll just use 60,000 feet. If you were to set the metric at 60,000 feet, 83% of the time that would be 4 wells, 40% of the time that would allow you to have 5 wells. Okay, and that's taking, that doesn't differentiate between whether it's a 1 mile, 2 mile, or 3 mile. All of that is merged into there on these multi-well sites, if that makes a sense. There's a different, in fact, the next page of this shows you the average length of wells on these locations. So I won't spend a lot of time on that again. I want you to have that data. You can look at that, help you understand that translation of wellbore length to number of wells.
Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Allward.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I noticed when you're pulling this together that your filter was GWA, which seems for somebody from the other side of the mountains rather parochial. And, you know, how does this fit in with the directional drilling of tight sands natural gas on the western slope?
So I'll defend my parochialism first. 97% of horizontal wells are being drilled in the GWA today, 97%. So we didn't want to exclude, as I've already said, we didn't want to exclude directional or vertical wells from this. But you will need a pretty large number of directional wells or vertical wells to start to get to these thresholds.
I think that's exactly my point, that you could have, you know, you're tasked, or we're tasked with defining large. And in this way, if you're not doing, and it doesn't say what's a large horizontally drilled platform, but rather large, and you would need, I mean, you would have a site with, you know, maybe 18 wells that still wouldn't be considered large. So I'm trying to figure out how, is that reasonable? I don't know, and I'd like to hear why that might be reasonable.
Sure. So the other factor, Commissioner, is that we're talking about these rules applying in urban mitigation areas. Not a lot of urban mitigation areas on the west slope, or for that matter in La Plata County. Not that they couldn't happen, won't happen, will eventually happen. But we were focused on the Front Range and horizontal drilling. The thing I like about the wellbore length, it sort of allows the operator to spend that budget, if you will, any way they want. I can get you some better data on vertical wells, but if you're hitting the Niobrara, you're going straight down 7,000 feet. If you're doing a directional, you know, maybe you've got a short lateral on that. So you know, roughly you could figure 7,000 feet divided into 90,000 feet. Again, though, there's another difference, which is the length of time to drill those wells is different, and what they produce is different. So a 7,000-foot vertical well is, one storage tank versus substantially more than that for the longer lateral wells. So if it would help in your decision to have some more data on vertical wells, we can try to get that to you. If not tomorrow, then certainly in the near term.
Director, since you brought it up,
I don't think I did, but
are there urban mitigation areas currently that you're dealing with outside of GWA?
yes, and Battlement Mesa is the first one that comes to mind. And
Thank you. I don't know of any there, but
There would be based on proximity to communities.
we concur that we don't know of any in Durango or La Plata County, but it's certainly a possibility.
thank you.
What's again not happening there yet really is any kind of meaningful horizontal development.
Okay, sir, thank you. Sorry to interrupt your flow.
Quite all right. So that's really all I have on what our proposed metrics are and why we got there, and our marker for those two metrics and what some of the other parties have proposed. We did want to share some pictures with you in the spirit of helping folks understand visually what 4 wells or 8 wells looks like. Greg is going to run through some slides here for you, I hope reasonably quickly. And you've seen some pictures already, but I think these will help everybody a little bit.
I like the backdrop for urban mitigation.
Standard slide. Can't take that.
We'll see if that works better. Sounds like it does. Thanks, Matt. Good afternoon, commissioners. I'm going to use that mouse. I need to run 2 mice here. So I'm going to just use a couple of example locations here in unincorporated Weld County. In the Front Range, the first example, location ID 434175, is in unincorporated Weld County, and the houses to the right are in the town of Frederick. The Jillison East Rim site is a multi-well pad with remote production facilities outlined on the slide. 4 new 1.5 mile horizontal wells were drilled from this location to develop 240 mineral acres, approximately, with a total wellbore length of approximately 61,000 feet. So what that looks like during drilling, here's a typical pad. I need to make sure I'm turning the right slides. Typical pad configuration during drilling. You can see the sound wall surrounding the site, and the relative shadow length shows the derrick height here in the middle of the image would well exceed the sound walls. And then I'll show you once the drill rig is removed. I'll show you an image from the site and how that looks. The yellow wedge here represents the field of view that I'll show in the next pad, and you'll be able to see the wellheads here on the center of the pad and the frac tanks remaining on site. The sound walls have been removed, and here are the 4 wellheads in the center of the pad, and the homes in the distance, again with the frac tanks remaining. Those homes are, the point of view of this picture is about 150 feet from those wellheads, and the homes are 700 feet beyond that, just to give you a sense of the proximity. Turning our attention to production facilities, I've used 2 relatively identical production facilities for the next series of slides, again, just to give you perspective, what they look like from the ground. So the next slide will show an image from the road of the Jillison production pad, which is the production facilities for that 4-well pad and another 4-well pad. And the proximity to homes about 1,500 feet away. So we are talking greater distances there. But again, the idea is to give you a perspective of what it looks like from the ground. This is 1,500 feet, or excuse me, 1,300 feet from the production facilities. The homes are 1,500 feet beyond those production facilities. This farm and house is equidistant, 600 feet from where the picture is taken and 600 feet from the production facilities. The next couple slides I'll show are production facilities from 1,500 feet away and 500 feet away. And so here, these production facilities in the middle of the screen at 1,500 feet, the tanks are clearly visible. The VOC combustors and separators are relatively obscured by trees, and the mountains are not obscured in the distance. As you get closer, though, you do start to have the bigger visual impact. The tanks now start to obscure the foothills. Very prominent in the image, the high peaks are still there. And I'd also like you to note that a fully mature tree does provide some level of visual buffering to those tanks, even in its without leaves on the tree. And I'm not saying any of that to diminish the size and scale of these facilities. These 28 tanks are 20 to 25 feet tall. The vapor recovery tower is 40 feet tall. 9 separators, VOC combustors. They are industrial and imposing in appearance. I'm going to look at one more site quickly, another site in unincorporated Weld County. This is a multi-well site including 9 horizontal wells with 1-mile laterals and associated production facilities on site. This well drains minerals from a little over 320 acres. The total wellbore length for this pad is about 104,000 feet, and each well is about 11,500 feet. So you can see here the proximity to the nearest homes, Home A and Home B. It is approximately 800 feet from either home to the wells, and 800 feet from the closer home to the production facilities, but 1,000 feet from the other. Here, Home B is in the foreground with the borer location in the background. The well pad is situated up here with the VOC combustors and the tanks further away. Again, you can see the field of view that I'm showing there. During drilling and completion operations, COGCC responded to 3 complaints regarding noise and 1 complaint regarding lights. The resident of Home A complained of noise and lights, and a resident farther to the south also complained of noise. The resident in Home B, quote, had no problems at all during drilling and completion. However, he did buy some blinds to mitigate the light in the bedroom. This another image of the same location, same homes, again showing the proximity, showing the visual mitigation that's being installed by the operator. And then looking back from the edge of the location to those homes, the visual mitigation trees in the foreground, the proximity to Home A and Home B, quite close. This area in here is the area that was used during drilling and completion and is now in interim reclamation. So the sound walls would have been staged on the far edge of this, and operations would have occurred in that entire area. And the wells on site, again, just to give you a flavor of the type of equipment that we're talking about, 9 wellheads, chain link fence enclosure, personnel access to each wellhead, 9 separators in secondary containment and in a fenced enclosure, and 28 tanks, VOC combustors, 9 separators, gas meter run, and VRU compressors. So significant facility, just again, providing an example. And that's what I've got for examples.
That's what we have for you, commissioners. Thank you very much, and happy to answer any additional questions.
None of those appear to be in a UMA.
That is correct. Actually, the first location, the first wellhead location with the 4 wells, that was permitted prior to the setback rulemaking. It would fall within a UMA by today's measurement.
Thank you.
Director?
Commissioner,
Yes. I just, after looking at the pre-hearing statements from other parties and hearing your presentation, I know that this does not include how large is too large to be located in a UMA, or should there be even a distance or setback for large facilities. But some of the other parties have proposed that. And I just wondered kind of what your take was on, should that occur? Do we have authority for that to occur? And what would be, you know, the ramifications or some of the issues that you would see around that?
I guess I would start, Commissioner, by saying that we did setback rulemaking in late 2012 and early 2013. It was a big lift, and we came out with what we have now. I don't think that the task force recommendations address setbacks. I think you could determine the ramifications as well as I could for were we to not allow some size of facility within an urban mitigation area. We chose to define this as large facilities in urban mitigation areas because I think it does matter that that's what we're talking about as opposed to different settings. And I think in my own opinion, it's appropriate to define large for an urban mitigation area as its own thing.
In the task force recommendation, it talks about the director's authority for citing options, or I forget the exact language there, but how do you interpret that in terms of what we should do in terms of rulemaking? Because that's the part that I'm kind of seeing that maybe we should build on.
Sure. So Rule 604 C2EI, which says that multi-well production facilities shall be located as far as possible from residential building units. As Ms. Berwinski pointed out, we have begun to closely examine proposed locations within 1,000 feet of building units and push pretty hard on why that location. I think that has worked pretty well. I think it will be enhanced by this advanced planning and collaboration process. I hope that it will. I think it will be enhanced by asking operators to work with local governments in the way that the recommendation does, that is before they have finalized the location. It is an issue I know for local governments and for us as staff when operators come in and say, well, this is where the surface owner wants it. And so this process, I hope, gives everybody an opportunity to be part of that conversation. I think that will help. The thing that is in this rule that I would put in the citing toolbox is probably the single most controversial thing in the rule, certainly from industry's point of view, and that's the duration concept. And to be very blunt, that concept is in part, or perhaps in substantial part, a response to this. What we're saying is you can build a large facility within 500 feet of homes. And if we're saying that, then what are we doing to mitigate those impacts? And we have put into the rule a number of required mitigation measures that, again, we'll talk about probably tomorrow. Required best management practices, required mitigation measures, and then sort of the list of expect to also deal with this. And the duration was one aspect of that. If you were to use state-of-the-art best practices throughout that are continue to emerge and evolve, some of us had the pleasure, and I think you were with us, to see a gas-fired turbine, electric generated fracking operation. I don't say that ever quite right. I'll get it right one of these days. They're generating electricity on site with lease gas and using that electricity to frack the wells. It's pretty impressive. And, so there are those kinds of mitigation measures available that I think you can mitigate the impacts to a point where the neighbors probably don't mind if you're there 9 months or 12 or whatever the number is. But you heard Mayor Pro Tem Gruber talk about, and you've heard others talk about the impacts if you're doing less than that. So we'll talk about duration when we get there, but that is one thing that we included in these rules.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I guess
Commissioner King.
Director Lepore, I guess I just want to go back to the point of Director Hawkins or Commissioner Hawkins. You have broad authority under existing statute and regulation to apply conditions of approval in most circumstances to protect health, safety, and welfare, correct?
I would say that is correct.
Okay.
Mr. Chair.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Rich. I was contemplating the question and the answer. Commissioner Allworth.
I mean, it was an amazing answer, wasn't it? It took a while to digest that. So I got just a couple questions, some that you've already certainly partially addressed, and I may want to ask them in a slightly different phrasing. And I really appreciate the difficulty of whenever you come up with some bright line that there are arguments for moving that line. And we're going to have to settle that somewhere or another. But, so there are a couple of things though. One is what I've learned over the last 8+ years is that words matter. And the recommendation 17 very clearly asked for a definition of a large-scale oil and gas facility, not one strictly in relation to urban mitigation areas. And so it seems to me by restricting this to an urban mitigation area, it means that it's going to be difficult if we need to extrapolate this to other areas of the state or other sorts of development projects, because we won't have a definition of what is a large scale facility for anything outside of an urban mitigation area. So I'd like to understand how you came to this so that I'm a little more comfortable with narrowing it to just your LUMA definition.
Thank you, Commissioner. So recommendation 17 says the recommendation is to recommend rulemaking to address local government collaboration with operators concerning locations for large-scale oil and gas facilities in urban mitigation areas as defined in COGCC rules. So that's where I was focused. To me, the thrust of 17 was, in fact, large-scale facilities in urban mitigation areas. I agree that your interpretation is reasonable, that you could say that we should have defined, or you still can define, just a large facility, and then when one of those is proposed in an urban mitigation area, these rules kick in. I think, as I already said, there is a difference as what constitutes large when you are in an urban area and not. So I would say that nothing precludes you from doing both. If you want to do both, that is have a large urban mitigation area facility and a large facility. I think if you're going to have a large facility, well, I don't know where you start. I don't know whether you define it for large in rural Mesa County or large in Erie. So that's why we went the way we went, was to define it for what it is in an urban mitigation area.
Great, thank you, I appreciate that. And appreciate the difficulty in working out with the well bores, for example, the way you've done the metric of taking into account new versus the total cumulative, and how those impacts, depending on what you're considering the impacts, whether or not that's appropriate. One of the things we've heard, in particular from the engineers on the commission, is concerns about the safety implications of these well pads with a large number of wells on them, as far as controlling fires, shutting in a well in an emergency and all that. So it seems to me that the total number of wells is important in addition to the way you've defined the metric. Can you help with, should we ignore that, or what would be your take on why to not consider the total number of wells?
I've really already told you my take on why not to consider the total number of wells for this definition. You're asking, I think, to me a different question, and you well know that I am not an engineer. What I do know is that reservoir pressures go down and well bore pressures go down over time. And I've had some conversations with Commissioner Craig about this, and y'all, you know, clearly you can and probably should pursue those conversations. For whatever it's worth, my English major understanding is that the Niobrara Shale is a low pressure formation that, yes, for a period of flush production, those wells are operating at fairly high pressures, but that pressure along with the production diminishes relatively quickly. So if the concern is that high pressure blowout situation, again, I'm probably not the right person to answer, but my understanding is that concern would diminish as the pressures, as time went by and as pressures went down.
Thank you again, and I'm sure that if others are unhappy with your answer, it will be brought up. I really appreciate that. The one last thing I have is just, again, I think it's a great idea to come up with some measures that are proxies for impacts and other things that are easy to understand and easy to assess ahead of time. Is there something in place or something you can envision in place so that we can evaluate whether these proxies are effective at indicating what the impacts are? You know, that we will be taking measurements or, you know, consolidating feedback or complaints or something so that we know, oh yeah, once you exceed 90,000 feet, you are definitely, you know, it is an impact, whereas below that, it's significantly less. And we'll know that that was a good measure so that in 8 years, we're confident that we won't need to change this. Is there some way you can see where staff or others would be able to assess the utility of the metrics?
8 years?
I figure I'm long, there's no chance I'm still on the commission then.
Forgive me while I confer with my colleagues. Yeah, I think, Commissioner, you know, we we could collectively come up with some metrics that we could measure and keep track of. The obvious one is complaints. The other thing, quite frankly, that does come to my mind is, again, is how long does it take to get these things drilled? How long is the construction cycle? Because I think that those, that's the height of the impacts, at least on the drilling side. But we kind of have, well, we have some data on those, that those data are changing because drilling times are coming down relatively quickly. But I'm happy to think on that some more and see what we might keep track of.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Benton.
Unless you had something else.
No, I was just going to be sure that Ms. Murphy wasn't counting all this time that we're creating. Commissioner Benton.
Thank you. So I think when I went through that, because there was a concern about wellbore safety for Arch County, I think there's some wording there about effectively some sort of automated pressure control systems put into place, and it sort of broadly talked about emissions, which to me could potentially mean some kind of a blowout and having subsurface well control put into place. So I think you've addressed that to some extent. We may need to dig into that a little bit deeper.
Yeah, I think that our intent in that mitigation measure is different than what Commissioner Craig has expressed previously about subsurface blowout preventers. Our intent is that if your emission control burners go down, you have a way to shut in the wells so that there's not a buildup of pressure.
I read that and into that, but was sort of hoping that might be a broader expanse that would address wellbore safety issues as well.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that would also tend to get Mr. Craig aligned on that.
I think it's something to be discussed,
Okay.
particularly in these large facilities near housing.
And this is more of a question. When I looked at the data that was provided on the tables, the difference, I believe the timing on, I think, drill and complete, the difference between a 1 mile and 2 mile lateral is down to about 3 days difference. So in a 10 well program, that's only an additional 30 days. So it leaves me some concern about footage versus well count and sort of the unintended consequences of what may come from limiting the total feet as opposed to well count. So don't need a comment on it. It's just a concern that I have about. I always worry about things that when you set that, what are the potential unintended consequences? Like I think you've heard about, well, you only put 4,000 barrels of storage, that's going to mean more trucks. Well, the number of trucks is based on the production level, not the number of tanks. So.
Appreciate it.
Okay, one final question. Hearing none, I think maybe we'll get the citizens group, which is sizable, a chance to weigh in.
Good afternoon. I am Dan Johnston, a member of Windsor Neighbors for Responsible Drilling, an impacted citizens group. As you can see, we have a number of folks here. There are 5 citizens groups that have allied together as parties from all across Colorado. I'd like to start by highlighting an agreement we have with the industry. In their first slide, the first point, they say that you should respect the intent and the language of recommendations 17 and 20. We believe the language is, as Commissioner Allward pointed out, and some of my colleagues and some others will address that. For me, I'm going to address a very narrow question, and that is the definition of a large scale. I'm going to use terms slightly differently than Director Lepore. I'm going to call the criteria the wellbore length, and the tank capacity as measures, and I'm going to call the numbers as metrics. Windsor Neighbors has consistently been a strong advocate of using borehole length and storage capacities as the measures for determining a large-scale oil and gas facility. These measures, we believe, are optimal for a number of reasons. First, they are objective, and those points can be easily added to the Form 2 for review by the staff and by the public. Second, they are multi-factor in that they contain elements of drilling, intensity, production, and operation. In our analysis, we could find no other factors that captured it so well. Third, they are not static. And so as actual drilling distances or storage capacities change, those measures will capture that. And fourth, they are robust and not easily manipulated. Having said that, the metrics included in the draft rules are simply too large. 90,000 feet of borehole length and 4,000 barrel tank capacity are too large for an urban mitigation area, which is what the rule presumably defines as it currently is proposed. Instead, this rule should specify 45,000 feet of borehole length and 2,000 barrel capacity. And let me be clear, borehole length should be cumulative for all wells. We don't want an operator to believe it can game the system by drilling only a few wells now, leaving, coming back to drill a few more to avoid the consultation, the best management practices, and the costs of being classified as a large scale. The tank capacity should be total capacity, including produced water tanks. Those toxic water tanks emit VOCs, they require truck traffic, they have spills, they explode. They actually have many of the same impacts as their hydrocarbon cousins. Their storage capacity must be included in the total tank capacity computation. As the director pointed out, please remember we are talking about triggers here, not caps. Triggers that require consultation, triggers that require certain best management practices, triggers that require using the best preventative technology. This definition and the associated rule, proposed rule 604C4, is not a cap. It does not stop ever larger and larger pads from being drilled next to homes, near schools, near high occupancy buildings. In fact, this proposed rule could be interpreted as giving a green light to operators to drill 20 or 30 or even more wells in an urban mitigation area. I trust you have seen the FLIR video that was shown earlier from Greeley, where the CEO of that operator says they routinely release those large amounts of VOCs into the atmosphere every time they open the thief hatch to transfer product from the tank to a tanker truck. That is an operator that is drilling in neighborhoods, it's drilling in UMAs, it's drilling near schools. Now, you have read in the written submissions, and will later hear from the industry, the proposed capacities, the metrics are too restrictive. They want hundreds of thousands of feet of borehole based on a well equivalent, and they want many tanks of, in some proposals, undetermined capacity. They want to build these massive well pads next to family homes and near schools without being required to use the best technology to control emissions and to suppress fires. They expect you to allow them to build sites of greater danger, of maximum impact, while not providing maximum protections to those impacted the most. These are only triggers in this definition. Triggers that simply require best management practices for fire, for explosion, for toxic emission hazards, for handling lightning strikes. We all know what happened in Greeley from the lightning strike last April. How can we even think about allowing larger pads next to homes and near schools without these protections? Triggers that require best management practices for leak detection, automated well shut-in. Triggers that limit flaring, require tank pressure management and dust control. These are no-brainers next to homes and near schools. The number of wells allowed without requiring these best management practices should be strictly limited. 45,000-foot cumulative borehole length, 2,000 barrel total tank capacity of all tanks. That's what this definition should specify. Now, this commission in recent years has created siting rules that use multi-well pad as the criteria because of the dangers those pads create and the impacts that they impose. This new rule, this definition, should more closely align with using multi-well pad as the criteria. The limits in this new rule are triggers for consultation. They're triggers for safety. 45,000-foot cumulative borehole length and 2,000 barrel tank capacity. No more. Not 1 foot more and not 1 barrel more.
Thank you.
It's hot up here. I'm Chandra Berry.
It's even hotter up here.
I'm sorry, I know, I can tell. I'm Chandra Berry. I'm from Fort Collins, Colorado. I'm a member of Windsor Neighbors for Responsible Drilling. I've tried very carefully to study all of the statements and responses of the parties involved in this hearing. After reading COGA's response, particularly 4E, it seems threatening. COGA states no one can discuss the application of mitigation measures outside of the UMA. They go on to say that any party who attempts to discuss this concept, which by the way is the cornerstone of Mr. Busher's recommendation 17, I've lost my mic.
No, you're okay.
Okay.
They're just trying to turn it down a little bit.
I don't blame them. I would too. The cornerstone of Mr. Busher's recommendation 17, they will be breaking Colorado law, compromise the integrity of this rulemaking, and COGA will file a motion of limine. So I had to research limine. I'm not exactly sure how it pertains to this hearing, but it sounds serious. However, Mr. Busher, the author of recommendation 17, has made it clear in his testimony today that when defining large-scale oil and gas facilities, the definition apply regardless of whether the proposed location was within an urban mitigation area. Therefore, the author clarified for us all that siting solutions and mitigations apply regardless of where the oil and gas facility should be located. With that said, and back to this concept of limine, the oil and gas industry is intimidating citizens and trying to prevent us from expressing our true opinions and being full participants in this hearing. At the risk of compromising my integrity, I fully support Mr. Busher's recommendation that regardless of where large-scale oil and gas facility is proposed, all Colorado citizens should be entitled to protections. In my community, I can see many homes that are not in a UMA. We have topography that separates subdivisions, and due to positioning of homes, it leaves many families out of a UMA. So in my community, why shouldn't the families who live in an area 1 home short of 22 homes be allowed to benefit from best management practices for fire suppression, noise, lights, and dust? If an operator chose a site next to 21 homes, why shouldn't those people be entitled to safety measures like automated well shut-ins? This is why you should honor the actual language that is in Recommendation 17 and not the words the industry wishes were in there. In the overview, the terms large-scale oil and gas facility and urban mitigation area are identified as distinctly separate terms. The industry wants you to believe these terms are joined at the hip. The term urban mitigation area only appears in the first subpart, while the term large-scale oil and gas appears in all three. Mr. Busher stated today, UMA was intentionally left out of the third part of Recommendation 17. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to be honest. This recommendation highlights the underlying problem is the concept of a UMA. It's actually flawed. The concept to limiting these protections to only people living in a UMA is flawed. All people in Colorado deserve the same protections. Mr. Chairman, that is you, that is me, and that is all of us in this room. We all deserve the same protections. If the commission does not support and adopt Mr. Busher's proposal as he authored and interpreted it, this commission will be turning its back on a large population of Colorado citizens. And thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ms. Berry. Now there are no questions. Okay. Perhaps later. I don't want to disappoint you.
All right. Hello, Commissioners. Thank you so much for taking the time to reflect on this issue today. We know it's a lot of time, but we realize that it's an important issue that's deserving the time. My name is Emily Hornback, and I'm a community organizer with Western Colorado Congress. I'm speaking on behalf of Leslie Robinson from our community group, the Grand Valley Citizens Alliance, who could not make it here today, unfortunately. Western Colorado Congress has come before this commission many times in the past, seeking all sorts of different types of protection for adjacent landowners. So this is a well-worn argument from us. Today, you've heard some stories of our Battlement Mesa members who came over from the Western Slope to make their case a little bit before you this morning, and you'll hear a little bit more about Battlement Mesa later today. And we really want to highlight Battlement Mesa's story as an example of how this is not a Front Range issue. You even heard Director Lepore mention that it's like dealing with Front Range drilling problems, but here you have a planned unit development, and there's a lot of complicated history about how it came to be. But regardless of that history, here you have a planned unit development with lots of subdivisions bumping into large-scale natural gas development in the Western Slope of Colorado. So we would just respectfully put this story before you as an example that UMAs are not, large-scale facilities and their impacts are not limited to the Front Range of Colorado. And we only expect that as more people move to the state of Colorado, both on the Front Range and the Western Slope, we will see more of those incidences occur in our communities in Western Colorado. As we're starting to talk about the large-scale definition a little bit, I'm going to add just to reiterate some of the testimony that Bob Arrington put forward today about length and if we're talking about certain borehole length versus storage capacity and like where do we run into this complication of oil development versus natural gas development and the reaches and what constitutes large scale. And, in Battlement Mesa, they're facing 53 wells on 2 pads in only the first phase of development, and that's not even including the development that's already happening on the outskirts of the community. So how many, quote, non-large scale facilities, if we're using these current metrics, will it take for us to raise an eyebrow about what's going on in Battlement Mesa if even 53 wells on 2 pads isn't enough to qualify as that definition because we're using borehole length. The UMA definition is also complicated in Battlement Mesa. It's complicated all over the state. As Chandra just mentioned, you can live in Windsor and have some neighbors that fall in that definition and others who don't. And, depending upon where you place a pad in Battlement Mesa, you might have part of one of the pads qualifying or one of the others not, even though there's still 6 different villages in the entire area that are going to feel the impacts of those developments. Just to reiterate also that, the UMA definition depends on building units, which does not reflect people. For example, in the Battlement Mesa proposal, there are 2 apartment complexes that are within 1,500 feet of one of the pads, and they only qualify as 2 building units and not necessarily the hundreds of people who live in both of those apartment buildings. So we would really like to see definitions that reflect people and the impacts to people and not just building units. But to move away a little bit from the Battlement Mesa story, I just want to reiterate that, Western Colorado Congress and the Grand Valley Citizens Alliance, we represent a lot of people in the broader Garfield County area and not just in Battlement Mesa. Most of our members live in dispersed rural areas that definitely wouldn't qualify as a urban mitigation area, no matter how many building units we put in that definition. However, we would say that the impacts of large-scale facilities don't go away just because of more or less building units within 1,000-foot distance from a facility. The impacts of light and noise and traffic and in air emissions, they're the same whether you are living in Windsor, they're the same whether or not you're living in Battlement Mesa, and they're the same if you're 5 houses at the end of a county road that have one of these large-scale facilities next to you in your homes. So the point we're going with that is that we just feel that in the spirit of recommendation number 17, you need to have a definition for large-scale facility that is independent of the urban mitigation area qualifier. We believe, that a few different people have stated the commission's declarative statement, when you all were formed to talk about the fostering the responsible and balanced development and production and utilization of natural resources, the natural resources of oil and gas in the state of Colorado in a manner that is consistent with the protection of public health, safety, and welfare of its Coloradans. And we would say that is all Coloradans, not just Coloradans who live in UMAs on the Front Range. Everybody's health is meaningful and important, even if you live in those 5 houses at the end of the county road. So to us, this means, again, that we would urge the commission to create a definition for a large-scale facility within 1,500 feet of a building unit with the same triggers that are being discussed for a urban mitigation area facility. To us, this means that the appropriate siting tools to move these large sites away from residences, as well as mitigation measures and best practices that are proposed in Rule 604C4 would apply to both types of large-scale facilities, both those that fall within an urban mitigation area, as well as large-scale facilities that would fall within 1,500 feet of a building unit. We need this definition of a large-scale facility because neither the state nor the industry has provided justification for why all Coloradans living next to large-scale oil and gas development are not deserving of the same protections. And we believe that a definition that stops at the boundary of an urban mitigation area is a blunt tool at best and does not do what we need to do, which is protect all the Coloradans and not just the very small percentage living within an urban mitigation area in the state of Colorado. A UMA fails to account for people and solely counts for the number of buildings within 1,000 feet, and it doesn't even do that very well. I don't need to reiterate those. I think I just made my points. But so I just want to thank you again for listening to us and our thoughts up here as representing impacted communities, and just remind that this is not abstract words on paper. This equals 3 years of drilling in Battlement Mesa in addition to the year plus of impacts that they've had already going on outside of the PUD. And then the next 8 to 10 years of what this project might look like for these people who retired in Western Colorado looking for the Colorado dream. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Hornback. Any questions?
Yeah.
Commissioner Benton.
A clarification, I think. A large or high occupancy is defined, I think, in the rules as hospital or school or something, but I'm wondering, what about an apartment building? How does that, is one apartment? No.
It's not in the definition. The prison is.
Oh, boy.
What I was just wondering though is under our residential building unit, which says, occupied residency by a person, a family, or families, is a single apartment a residential building unit, or is the whole apartment building? How is that interpreted by staff?
You mean one building with 10 apartments?
Well, like my condo in San Diego had 320 units. So is that one building or is that 320 separate households? That's a lot of
But-
people.
I think by definition, it's one. By our definition, it's one.
Yeah. So-
Okay, were you going to respond to that?
I'm going to have Mr. Garamo respond.
Pass the buck.
Every chance I get.
Going back to the government. So you're correct, it is not explicit in our rule. However, it is one of those items that is very much within the consideration of the oil and gas location assessment review on a technical basis. So it does give us the ability to consider size of the apartment building and not just the individual, the number of apartments in the building as individual dwelling units.
By policy as opposed to by regulation.
From a land use perspective, that's how we do it. Each one of those is a separate dwelling. It's not just one big building.
By policy.
No.
No, by regulation.
That's by our city code.
Okay. Okay, any other questions? I'm working, I'm trying, I'll get you questions. Okay, next presenter.
We do have a PowerPoint out. Will the mouse reach down here?
Real quick, sorry, Jackie. My name is Matt Samuelson. I represent the Citizens for a Healthy Community, Grand Valley Citizens Alliance, Well Air and Water, Western Colorado Congress, and Windsor Neighbors for Responsible Drilling. And final point that I wanted to summarize from the three folks that preceded me was that the opinion that in order to faithfully implement all three prongs of recommendation 17, we need a definition of a large-scale oil and gas facility that goes beyond the urban mitigation area. Emily just pointed out, she read you some language that for a definition of a large-scale facility, which was any oil and gas location proposed within 1,500 feet of a building unit, and then use the same triggers of 45,000 feet and 2,000 barrels. Thought being there is that all Coloradoans who are living in close proximity to a large-scale facility are deserving of the siting tools and the best management practices and the mitigation measures that are laid out in the proposed rules. And so I just wanted to point that out, that in the alternative draft rules from these 5 organizations, we've laid out that particular definition in order to capture the true intent of recommendation 17.
Okay, thank you, Matt.
Thank you very much.
Any questions? Any questions at all for Ms. Berry? Okay, I am sorry. Thank you very much.
You look way too anxious.
Mr. Chairman, without questions, that concludes the community group's presentation.
Okay. Okay, now we're at ACDAN.
Acting, you got it.
All right,
Okay,
please proceed.
all right. I'm Jackie Kowalski, and I'm the president of Adams County Communities for Drilling Accountability Now. And on behalf of Acton, I would like to thank the commissioners and the staff for accommodating the many participants today. Additionally, the patients, the COGCC staff, and all parties to the hearings have afforded those of us that are new to this process has been greatly appreciated. And in order to stay on time and on task today and tomorrow, we will be reading our statements because there are several of us. Acton is a nonprofit organization that was formed in response to a proposal to site 20 wells in the middle of the Wadley Farm subdivision, which is a small piece of unincorporated Adams County of about 120 homes, and it's surrounded on all four sides by the city of Thornton. We believe it is irresponsible to site these large oil and gas facilities in neighborhoods, any neighborhood, which is why we're here today and not at our jobs or home caring for our families. We're here addressing the commission because the consequences of not being here are much greater. We have two purposes we hope to cover in our testimonies. First is to refute the underlying and occasionally overt message from the COGCC that this rulemaking process primarily impacts the oil and gas industry. While any one of the operators here today may choose to go through the process of siting a large UMA facility once every few years, a facility sited in any of our neighborhoods will be something we may live with every day for the rest of our lives. To say we have put in hundreds of hours getting up to speed on neighborhood drilling is an understatement. Our second purpose in being here today is to make recommendations to the proposed rules that stem from Task Force Recommendation Number 17. Regarding the definition of a large UMA facility, we request you put in the language that there be no large scale facilities in urban mitigation areas. The evidence to be presented today by Susie Merrill and Darren Greening should give you cause to consider our recommendation. Out of respect for everyone's time, we chose to focus our presentation on information we had not yet heard brought before the Commission's attention, and the two citizens presenting that today live in the nearby neighborhoods of Wadley Farms 3 and Cherrywood Park respectively and speak from a great deal of professional experience. Under the topic of BMPs and mitigation measures, which obviously will not come up until tomorrow, we intend to bring to your attention numerous ways in which best management practices often come with their own hazards, which may be one reason the regulations, with few exceptions, do not specify what exactly is meant by best management practices. After looking into several, we were struck by how the risks of these the risks that these facilities create are just shuffled differently under the guise of a BMP. The requirement per the proposed rules to engage BMPs for large UMA facilities does not make oil and gas development in neighborhoods acceptable. Neither do the mitigation measures, which we will also discuss in greater detail tomorrow. The existing mitigation measures and the proposed duration limit do not even begin to address the numerous significant and occasionally life-altering effects of the 24/7 nonstop drilling and completion activities. For the facility proposed in Wadley Farms, the mind-numbing noise has been predicted to last up to 9 months. And I would just like to point out that 9 months is a lifetime for someone on hospice care in their own home. 9 months is an entire school year for a student. 9 months of unending overstimulation is impossible for special needs kids. These are a few of the everyday experiences of people in their homes, and you cannot adequately mitigate them. Even the straightforward financial impact on people's nest eggs, the equity in their home, is beyond your control to mitigate once you allow oil and gas facilities to move in the middle of neighborhoods. Homes and neighborhoods are highly valued by their residents for more reasons than can be enumerated here. Large oil and gas facilities are incompatible with just about all of them. The people speaking on behalf of Acton today are residents of the communities that will be immediately impacted by your decision on these regulations. We are the experts on our neighborhood. We are the people most impacted by the regulation changes. I thank you for your time. At this time, I do want to acknowledge that Lieutenant Greening's schedule today prohibited him from being here. It was very hard to predict exactly when our testimony would be. So his statement will be read at his request. And first, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Dr. Susan Merrill to discuss two of the most recent health impact studies. And we could answer questions then after that. Are you on or you want?
Hello and thank you. Thank you for your attention on this very important matter. My name is Susan Merrill, and I practiced pediatrics as an outpatient pediatrician at Kaiser Westminster Clinic for 30 years and practiced evidence-based medicine. Much of my time was spent in counseling parents and patients on the benefit of preventative measures, where it be gun safety, car seats, seatbelt usage, and bike helmet usage, just to name a few. If a family approached me about seeking guidance regarding living near or close to a natural oil and gas development, I would gather information before rendering my professional opinion. I reviewed the 2 articles that you have received copies of, one from the Colorado lead author Mackenzie and one from Pennsylvania lead author Casey. They were peer-reviewed scientific studies in reputable journals. Additional reputable studies have been done looking at health impacts of oil and gas developments, but given time constraints of this hearing, I am focusing on the 2 articles referenced. My conclusion after reading these studies is that enough scientific evidence and data exist from the Colorado study supporting an association with 2 significant birth defects, congenital heart disease and neural tube defects, and an increase in association with prematurity, which are babies born before 37 weeks gestation, in the Pennsylvania study, to be concerned. Of course, all 3 of these conditions can be caused by multiple factors. We know that the first trimester of pregnancy is a particularly critical time for the developing fetus. Pregnant women are advised to take folic acid supplements, refrain from alcohol and tobacco usage, and be very careful with use of any medication that's not under supervision by their physician. The fetus's heart, spinal cord, and brain begin forming by the 4th week. Congenital heart disease are structural abnormalities of the heart and its vessels that are noted at birth. Neural tube defects are abnormalities of the brain, spine, or spinal cord occurring during this critical first trimester. Congenital heart disease and neural tube defects, along with prematurity, can have tremendous costs, medical sequelae, and even death as a consequence. The studies raise concern that possible toxic exposures during pregnancy from the oil and gas facilities may be playing a role with these 3 conditions. However, avoidance of proximity to natural oil and gas developments is a preventable one. Both studies noted a higher association the closer mothers live to oil wells. More studies are needed, and many are in process currently to further explore the potential for negative health impacts. I would have to counsel any family that asked about the very real negative health impacts that are starting to come out in studies. Allowance of this natural gas and oil development in a residential neighborhood would not be advisable and should not be allowed. Would you choose to live in a neighborhood with oil and gas development? Given the scientific data discussed today, I ask all of you in your decision-making capacity to please help us prevent these devastating pediatric conditions. Thank you, and I will be happy to take questions.
Any questions at this time?
Dr. Wolk?
Oh.
I should be recognized by the chair. I'm sorry, Dr. Merrill.
I recognize you.
Thank you. I just wanted to give Dr. Merrill a couple more minutes to talk about the limitations of those studies in a little bit more detail, just so we don't mislead the general public.
So you've asked a question that won't count against her time?
No.
Okay.
Well, the studies that were done, the lead author in Colorado was Mackenzie. It was a group done, epidemiologists, and they studied.
Just the limitations. I can remind you of them.
I can find them.
Well, let me ask it this way. Did they use the mother's place of residence in the Mackenzie study, or where the mother delivered?
They looked at the mother's place of residence and assumed, and I think where she delivered, I think it was where she delivered at the time that she gave birth.
Correct.
And
not
most
the
of them, it was an assumption that they had not relocated. And the authors admitted that there are some limitations.
Did they use
you know,
active wells only, or did they also include shut-in wells or inactive wells as well?
I believe it was active wells, you know.
That's incorrect.
Well, the study in Lisa McKenzie, you know, they looked at 124,842 births between 96 and 2009 in Colorado. The Pennsylvania study was from January of 2009 to 2013, and I think that was all active and unconventional natural gas. And I had communications with both lead author McKenzie and Brian Schwartz on the Pennsylvania study. And I can tell you that there are many ongoing studies.
No, I understand the ongoing studies, and I appreciate the need for ongoing studies. I just think we have to be careful not to mislead or make presumptions or conclusions by only presenting part of the data.
And what I'm saying to this commission is that I'm not saying it's a cause, but it's an association, and it clearly, in my reading, got my attention. And, you know, I will just, since you raised the question, it makes me concerned. I mean, I started to live when the tobacco industry swept a lot of stuff under the rug, and there was a lot of monetary benefit because of that. And millions of people died because of lack of recognition of harm. And so, you know, I don't want to be part of having the oil industry ignore potential real concerns. And that's what my plea is to you, is don't turn a blind eye, don't have tunnel vision on this. Be open to the fact that this might be, because this oil and gas development in both Colorado and Pennsylvania have been on a major fast track. And as you know, Dr. Wolk, these studies take time to do. They don't happen overnight. It takes a lot of time. And it takes time to catch up with the rapidity of the oil and gas development that's going on in both of these two states.
I appreciate that, and I can assure you, no one, at least myself, speaking for myself, and the Department of Public Health and Environment are not turning a blind eye, so thank you.
Well, I appreciate that, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay.
My name is Luisa Mufta Lopez, and I want to thank the commissioners for giving me an opportunity to speak today on behalf of Darren Greening, a lieutenant for Adams County Fire Rescue. He cannot be here today due to other work commitments. I am not a firefighter, but I did attend the Thornton Citizens Fire Academy to experience and understand some of the fire department's daily and emergency operations. This is the statement he asked me to read in his absence. While the drilling industry has accounted for numerous safety concerns, we unfortunately have to face unforeseen emergencies that tax the abilities of those tasked to mediate them. The picture shown here is that of wastewater storage tanks which caught fire this last March within the Douglas, Wyoming Fire Protection District located just south of Casper, Wyoming. As of this time, the origin and cause of this fire is still undetermined. The picture was taken during the time in which the department was waiting for the necessary supplies to attack the fire. The department was able to gather 150 gallons of concentrate, but because of a lack of proper equipment, was not able to knock on this fire. It was finally controlled by use of copious amounts of water over several hours of firefighting activities. Should a fire occur, such as this one, the required staffing and firefighting equipment would have to be specialized in from surrounding departments. This process would include requesting a foam supply from companies such as Suncor, Windsor Fire Department, or Bennett Fire Department. A burning container of this size using the NFPA National Fire Protection Association calculations demands a foam concentrate supply of 525 gallons with the same amount on site as reserve prior to starting fire attack. This amount of foam will require approximately 16,000 gallons of water per 525 gallons of foam concentrate. The proposed drilling site in Wadley Farms is located in a semi-rural subdivision where there is not a city-supplied water main system. Fighting a large fire would require the use of shuttle tenders. Obtaining these will take a mutual aid request from a number of departments. From the time of first arriving crews and the officer setting up their plan of attack, an estimated time of an hour to assemble the needed equipment before a fire attack could begin, it would still take an estimated 1 to 2 hours of fire attack prior to the fire being extinguished. Once extinguished, the scene then becomes a hazardous materials incident, again requiring the service of the local emergency crews for mitigation and containment of any materials no longer contained. The smoke plume created by this fire would have the potential of affecting homes located to the northeast and south of the proposed site, causing wide evacuations, possibilities of severe health issues, and very expensive cleanup. Even if the drilling company is found liable for the cost associated with this, there will be a large time and monetary demand placed on the residents and owners of the surrounding properties. To help speed the fire attack, it would be recommended that the required amount of foam concentrate and the necessary amount of water to produce the foam be staged at a suitable site located near the proposed drilling site, and that the equipment of the first responding department be verified that it is compatible and capable of handling the task. Thank you for your time. On behalf of Lieutenant Darren Greening.
Thank you, Ms. Lopez. Any questions? Okay. I think we move to the Sierra Club.
I think that they've chosen to defer their time. I'm certain they'll correct me if I've misstated that. I believe that Ms. Hall, the West Slope governments, and the allied local governments are the next three parties on this particular topic. They can come up.
West Slope governments?
Catherine Hall, West Slope governments, and the allied local governments.
Okay. Okay, then, we're going to begin with
West Slope Governments, Kirby Wynn.
Kirby, turn your microphone on, please. Good.
Green is good.
Green is good.
Kirby Wynn with Garfield County and Tamara Allen with Garfield County. We're here representing the West Slope Governments, which consist of Moffett County, Rio Blanco County, Mesa County, Montezuma County, Garfield County, the town of Silt, and the town of Parachute. We've been going through all the proceedings and participated in the Governor's Task Force outreach meetings, that sort of thing, and working together to try to understand all the materials coming in from the groups. And so we drew the short straw, and so we're here to represent all those 7 governments. And with that, I will turn it over to Tamara Allen.
Great. Thank you, commissioners. Thank you for your time and attention to this topic. We'll, I think following the protocol, talk specifically about the definition for the large UMA facility here this afternoon and spend some time with you tomorrow on the following elements of the proposed rules. First and foremost, did want to just highlight, I think, the topic of our, I think maybe heading of our letters to you, both in the pre-hearing statement and rebuttal, is I think generally the West Slope governments and the coalition therein largely find the rules and scope unnecessary. We believe that a fair bit of what is trying to be implemented here in the rulemaking process can easily be implemented at the local level through local land use authority and really proactive and engaged conversation with our operators and adjacent residents, property owners, and surface use owners, owners of surface lands. That said, we did think it was particularly important to be constructive in our comments. We do believe there's probably a high likelihood that you move forward with a fair bit of this proposed rules, and therefore wanted to provide some additional information and commentary from our experience, especially in the Western Slope, but specifically for Garfield County as well. With that, looking at some of the metrics proposed, the 90,000 feet in wellbore length, as well as the 4,000 barrels of tankage. I think what you've heard is a huge range. I think Director Lepore was very accurate in saying that when you draw a line in the sand, nobody's going to particularly like it, either high or low. I think that we support that from the Western Slope Government Coalition. These numbers may not be the exact correct numbers, but do think that they find a good balance between a large-scale facility versus just a regular or average-size scale facility. From our personal experience at Garfield County, did want to note on the tankage, we very recently had a very protracted conversation about what size of tankage should be allowed as a by-rate use in our county. There was a lot of gnashing of teeth, not just at the political level, but between ourselves, the operators, planning staff, and other property owners. But ultimately, we did find that 5,000 barrels was an appropriate number, and think that correlates fairly well to where your staff and Director Lepore have landed on the 4,000 barrels of tankage. So wanted to tell you that I think that number is pretty darn close to being a good number. Certainly from our experience, that was where our regulations ended up falling, and we certainly do regulate anything greater than 5,000 barrels. That is generally in our county, as you probably know, for produced water, not necessarily for hydrocarbons. So as part of our pre-hearing statement, we certainly think that I believe La Plata County made a specific request to expand that definition to produce water, and do think that's appropriate for the type of development you see on the Western Slope. Did want to talk specifically about the conversation that you've heard from several of your parties about removing the UMA from the large-scale facility definition. The Western Slope governments certainly do not support removing the urban mitigation area from that definition. Many of our facilities would easily become large-scale facilities and be subject to the consultation therein. Do you think that would be both arduous for our operators and not necessarily solve the real issue here, which I think is the highlight between how industry develops and where people live versus some of our outlying or more rural areas. Again, keeping the UMA as part of that definition we think is important and valuable, and certainly gets at the intent of your recommendation 17. The last two topics I wanted to hit on this I guess letter A in regard to the large scale metrics was the conversation submitted by a number of other parties in regards to expanding the definition to add additional metrics. I think Director Lepore said that the metric of the well bore length as well as the tanks were important because those were actually what correlates to the actual impact versus being the impact itself. I think part of the request you saw was to expand that to the emissions, to VOC, to traffic impacts, as well as acreage, and so forth. And I think duration was the fourth one that was requested. Those are simply the impacts that come from the type of development, the wellbore length, and as well as the tankage. So I think it's important to keep that, I guess, measurement small, narrow, and as simple as we can for the ease of use and administration. The last piece that we did want to weigh in on this item specifically was in regards to the proposal, I believe, provided by COGA and maybe other industry components, was actually looking at a simple and predictable metric. There was, I think, conversation on whether wellheads was a better metric. And despite the fact that I think Western Slope governments do think that wellbore length and tank storage is appropriate, we also think that there may be room to have a conversation about if facilities are fully piped, on whether that actually changes that metric if there is a different scale. Our experience certainly in the Western Slope is that if facilities are piped, they have a far less impact on adjoining property owners and areas within the residents, just from the sheer volume of traffic, noise, and odors that come from that type of change in the facility. And again, that's piping versus having surface transportation to and from those large scale facilities.
Questions? Ms. Allen, are there other than Battlement Mesa, are there other urban mitigation areas in these West Slope counties that you represent?
Great question. There's certainly none that are currently being developed that I know of. Battlement Mesa, I will spend some time talking to you about our experience there tomorrow. But there certainly is potential for additional urban mitigation areas, whether that be on the periphery of the city of Rifle, town of Silt, city of Durango. I think you heard those are certainly areas that have the propensity to be an urban mitigation area.
The second question I'm formulating as I think, which is probably not going to turn out well. You're representing several different counties and communities. And I've heard you say that as far as Garfield County is concerned, you've sort of worked out a pretty good arrangement with how you deal with the residents in your county as well as the oil and gas operators. And so you're kind of saying maybe these regulations aren't really necessary for you to have that kind of cooperative effort.
We clearly had a tool to use and we used it.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I think that's exactly what we're saying. We have been very successful in Garfield County as well as other areas that we represent and having good dialogue with our operators. Like I said, I don't want to share too much about the testimony tomorrow, but do want to specifically share our experience with Battlement Mesa and what's going on with that, especially how it may interface and how you may think about that in regards to the proposed consultation and mediation process.
And then my final question has to do with, I'm sure what you've said represents Montezuma County. I know some of those folks pretty well. But you feel pretty confident that Rio Blanco, which has had oil and gas for several years, Moffett County less so, they feel pretty much the same way.
I believe so. They have all reviewed the pre-hearing statements that we have submitted to you, as well as the rebuttal. Kirby has done a great job vetting them with them to make sure that they are in support of what we have submitted, as well as what we'll be telling you.
Thank you. Questions?
Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Hallward.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I didn't even mention Mesa County. You noticed that.
I did, and I won't either. But I will say thanks for, hinting at what you'll be talking about tomorrow, so I'll make sure to tune in.
Great.
So what I was wondering, you're talking about whether a site is fully piped versus not. My understanding on what part of the staff recommendation is that tank volume level is set low enough that it should encourage the piping. And so do you see that as meeting kind of what criteria you might be thinking of, or are you thinking something different?
That's an excellent point. We think largely about the context of how we develop our resources in the Western Slope, which is very different, obviously, than the Front Range.
We do it a lot better.
How much tankage is required. You may be very correct in your assumption there that in the Front Range, should those be piped, that you are looking at a much smaller threshold for tankage, which I believe is accurate and was represented. Again, the suggestion, I guess, at surface level, without digging into the specifics, anything that we can do in our counties to encourage piping, we certainly do that. We understand it has a huge benefit to not just the traffic on the roads, but to kind of the peace and quiet and the ability to coexist with these types of facilities.
Corollary question, if that's all right.
A corollary?
Yes.
Good. Okay. I'm going to look that up. Wait.
First, it just, not to slight Moffett County, they've had production there for a very long time. Just as more or less with respect to the facilities that you have on the pipe locations, typically driving back and forth to Grand Junction, you'll see oftentimes multi-well pads, and there will be a wellhead and then oftentimes a small fired vessel of some type or another. So the correlation, and the question is that the number of fired vessels correlates to the number of wells on the pad site more than whether or not they're piped.
The number of what vessels?
Fired vessels like a
Combustor?
combustor, something with a,
No, there's usually a combustor.
right, for the fire stack. But if you have, say, a meter run or a wellhead, or if they do produce some liquids, so oftentimes you'll have a little small separator or something sitting there.
Yeah, there will be a separator.
Is it per well or is it for all the wells?
It's,
I can't get into the specifics, but from our experience, it's not necessarily a 1-to-1 ratio per se. They are able to consolidate the sites, their dehydration units, compressors, those kinds of facilities, and actually in total or cumulative actually reduce the numbers if they're able to pool those with several different wellhead sites.
And yeah, if you can pull the minerals
Yeah.
or something like that. Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Hall.
This is a lot more intimidating than your office. I'm not sure how you use it.
Use the scroller.
And you turn your microphone.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, and thank you for this opportunity. I'm Catherine Hall, and I've had the privilege of speaking before you on 2 previous occasions regarding applications that had been submitted with extensive errors and inaccuracies. In respect for everyone's time, I'm going to jump right into the topic of defining large-scale oil and gas facilities while acknowledging the agenda states large UMA facility. The task force was created in order to address the ongoing and increasingly frequent encroachment of oil and gas development into urban areas. It was not created to narrowly address the encroachment of such development within only a handful of locations each year. Recommendation 17 was carefully drafted and unanimously approved. It was considered by many task force members to be a broad and wide sweeping recommendation, which is multifaceted and incorporates provisions from many other recommendations, including Recommendation 13. Before the Commission can implement any rules associated with Recommendation 17, 2 critical questions must be answered. What is the author's intent in drafting this unanimously approved recommendation? And even more importantly, what does the plain language of Recommendation 17 state? Mr. Busher reaffirmed his intent as the primary drafter of this recommendation this morning. To avoid repetition, I won't go into that again. Even more essential is the need for this Commission and all parties to reread Recommendation 17 and to focus on the plain language of the recommendation instead of the language that the industry wishes were included in the recommendation. The preamble of Recommendation 17, shown on the screen, through its plain language and use of punctuation, establishes 2 separate and distinct terms. Large-scale oil and gas facilities, which must still be defined through this rulemaking, and urban mitigation area, which is already defined in the COGCC rules. I'm actually deviating from my notes to respond to West Slope government's statement regarding if we expand out of UMA, it'll trigger more consultations. What you'll see is in part, the first subpart, that's the only time a consultation will be triggered, is when such a large-scale facility happens to be proposed in a UMA. When we recommend taking away the combined term large UMA facility, we're not talking about expanding that consultation process, just the protections afforded in the 3rd subsection. So I felt the need to expand there. While the first subpart instructs the COGCC to define and adopt a consultation process which is triggered when the large-scale oil and gas facility is proposed within the UMA, the 2nd and 3rd subparts include no reference to UMAs. Instead, the 3rd subpart uses the terms communities, residential areas, and neighboring communities. Some industry representatives have suggested in their written statements the terms communities and neighboring communities in subpart 3 are merely synonyms for UMA in that they involve multiple building units within a specific area. Industry representatives claim the terms urban area and urbanized area and neighborhood all refer to UMA. Industry further claims that these terms are used interchangeably and that all of them refer to the specified area with multiple building units, that is a UMA. And that was a quote from industry's statements. That claim is misleading. The term UMA is not synonymous with a neighborhood or an urban area. Instead, UMA is defined solely on the number of building units or a high occupancy building unit within 1,000 feet of a proposed oil and gas location. A building unit is not equivalent to a home. Such attempts by industry members and their representatives to mislead this commission and to divert your attention away from the plain language of Recommendation 17 and away from the very spirit of the task force mission should be acknowledged and discouraged. Further, industry's use of partial quotes and misquotes in their pre-hearing statements and responses should raise questions as to the accuracy and validity of their other claims, many of which are in stark opposition to the plain language of the recommendations, numerous other parties, and multiple members of the task force. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hall. The task force recommendations include a process paragraph or series of paragraphs.
Yes, sir.
And reading through those, would you say they support your argument?
Absolutely, sir. It's multifaceted, as Mr. Busher pointed out this morning.
Questions for Ms. Hall? That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Okay, I see Weld County. What do you see, Ms. Murphy?
I see Adams County.
Okay.
I see Allied Local Governments.
I'm sorry, you're right.
And I don't see Weld County. But that's because, I believe that's true. I'd have to check with Mr. Barker, but.
Okay, so we're going to hear from Adams County. You're good to go.
I believe it's good evening, commissioners. My name is Kristen Sullivan. I am the Deputy Director of Community and Economic Development at Adams County. And I'm here to represent the position of the Adams County Board of County Commissioners. As you'll hear many times throughout the 2 days for hearings here, the Wadley Farms neighborhood is a neighborhood within unincorporated Adams County. And many of these rules are very applicable to that situation. Our first comment is that we, like many other local governments, believe that the current definition of large-scale urban mitigation facility is still too large to pass a common sense test. We encourage the Commission to revise the proposed definition for large UMA facilities to half the current threshold. The current proposal within Recommendation 17 would allow up to, in our calculations, 8 wells on a single site to be drilled without requiring operators to collaborate with the local community. Most reasonable people would agree that a single site with 5, 6, 7, or 8 wells within 1,000 feet of your home deserves special attention. With an average drilling timeline of 12 days per well, 8 wells could translate to 96 days of sustained drilling activity on a site. We would also be supportive to some of the changes that were mentioned earlier today to account for a reduction or for consideration of the total borehole length as it relates to the location or proximity of certain facilities. We think that the intent of the task force recommendation is preserved with our recommendation to reduce the definition of large-scale UMA. Our second point on this topic is that we're concerned that only new wells would be counted in this definition, but existing yet active wells on the site would not be counted towards the total cumulative depth. We propose that existing wells up to 5 years old be included in the definition. It's reasonable to assume that existing wells less than 5 years old are active, productive, and they're very likely part of what constitutes a current operation and would contribute to some of the impacts. Therefore, such wells should be counted in the definition of cumulative depth on any new or expanded well site. We believe this will more accurately capture the scale of a site and will address concerns about phasing the submittal of permit applications to avoid these processes outlined in recommendation number 17. With that, I'd like to conclude our comments and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Ms. Sullivan? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I believe it's allied local governments at this point.
Allied local government, well, we had those. You have some more?
We had the West Slope Govs.
There are other counties besides West Slope? How shall we start, Mr. Zur?
I'll start.
Oh, good.
Hi, I'm Kim Sanchez. Hello. Kim Sanchez, I'm Chief Planner with Boulder County. I'm here speaking on this first topic with the Allied Local Government Group, which is comprised of Boulder County, City of Longmont, City and County of Broomfield, City of Brighton, City of Fort Collins, City of Thornton, City of Loveland, and La Plata County. We'll be having several members of our group speak to various things that are of interest to their particular municipality. First off, I'd like to thank the Commission for the opportunity to comment here today. We appreciate your attention and stamina for listening to our testimony today. We also want to thank the COGCC staff for indulging us with so much of their time over this past 4 months. While we appreciate the outreach structure that they set up to receive comments from local governments and acknowledge that they've been very generous with their time in receiving our input to date, there's a difference between listening to people and doing something with that information. We feel heard, but as others have expressed, we are disappointed to see how little of our input has been represented in the draft rule. You've already have a sense of the exasperation that people are feeling in coming to this meeting here today. We share that. It's been an intensive, frustrating, and somewhat disillusioning process to invest so much in the public process with such little net result. That said, on a positive note, it's forced me to do a lot of yoga. So on the plus side, I thank you for contributing to my Zen. In any case, we are here today and we hope that this next 2 days can be an opportunity for you to consider our changes for incorporation into the rule. The first thing that we'd like to speak to is the UMA issue that's come up several times. The COGCC staff proposed rule has interpreted recommendation 17 to apply only to urban mitigation areas. In short, we think that urban mitigation areas are too limiting. From the very beginning of this process, starting in July, the allied local governments have posited that this provision has been too narrowly construed by COGC staff. Rather, a fair read of Recommendation 17 suggested intended siting tools and mitigation measures to be applied to all large-scale facilities near residential areas, not just large-scale facilities in higher density residential areas, which I've heard referred to in many different conversations. If you break down Recommendation 17 into the 3 issues it is intending to address, the first part deals with defining and adopting a local government consultation process for large facilities proposed within a UMA. The second part addresses defining what constitutes large-scale oil and gas facilities, taking into consideration scale, proximity, and intensity criteria. And part 3 addresses the authority of the director to use siting tools to locate facilities away from residential areas when feasible. Repeat that last part. citing tools to locate facilities away from residential areas. This doesn't qualify the residential areas as UMAs like the first part of the recommendation does. It refers to all residential areas. Consequently, the suggested rule change proposed by the Allied Local Government Group is to change the proposed definition of large UMA facility to simply large-scale facility. This will define the threshold and allow siting tools and mitigation measures to be applied to large facilities beyond UMAs and gets precisely to some of the questions that have been raised in your dialogue here today. It's been our position all along that there should be additional protections for large facilities wherever they affect residents and communities, regardless of whether those people are in UMAs or not. The impacts of these large facilities will be so significant compared to what is traditionally experienced that they merit greater attention in any and all locations, whether that's in or outside of a UMA. It's only logical that residents living near this kind of large industrial facility outside of UMAs deserve the same protections as those who live within them. Given this and our reading of Recommendation 17, we were relieved when Commissioner Busher, in his pre-hearing statement and again in his testimony here today, confirmed his intent for the third part of Recommendation 17 to apply beyond urban mitigation areas, as well as to have 8 other of the task force members in a letter that you received dated November 9th, 2015, support that this was their understanding as well when they voted for it. If this clarification from the author of the recommendation himself is not enough to expand application of protections beyond UMAs, let's look at what the rules as proposed actually do on the ground. In the stakeholder meeting, COGCC indicated that 27% of wells in the Wattenberg were larger than 90,000 feet of borehole length, which was the rationale as to why 90,000 feet was selected as the appropriate proxy, or at least a starting place for the draft rule. At our request, COGCC provided a list of UMA locations approved since August 2013. There were 14 of them. 13 of those UMA locations had 8 or more wells or oil tanks and would be considered a large facility by COGCC's proposed standard. This is out of a total of 1,700 Form 2As that were approved in that same time period, which means that the rules as proposed would impact less than 1% of the oil and gas locations in Colorado. We are not resolving statewide issues if the rules we adopt only affect 13 well sites. The scope of their effect is inconsequential. Moreover, from a Boulder County perspective, we believe that one home or family farm, as it may be, is just as important to protect as 11 homes in a half circle or 22 in a 1,000-foot full circle. We've prepared a map to illustrate the implications in Boulder County as an example. Map.
There's the map. And I have the honor of trying to explain the map. I think it's also in your packet, so you should have had a chance to look at it. And this was really just out of curiosity. We have a number of existing drilling sites in Boulder County, and we wanted to see what would happen if we did those circles and tried to get a sense for how many would be in urban mitigation areas. And so there's over 100 sites that we have on there. And the legend, you can see that there are some where there are no houses within that circle. And that's largely attributable to the open space program that we have in Boulder County. And that there are only a couple of sites where these existing wells would actually qualify for being in urban mitigation areas. And frankly, at least the ones in the Southeast County, those, and probably the one up in Gun Barrel, the wells predated the development in any event. And so from this, I think it's clear that in Boulder County, it's this rule, if it's limited to urban mitigation areas only, has almost no effect. And that doesn't mean that oil and gas development would have very little effect. In the area of the Wattenberg, and so just for a little bit of context, the gray blob at the north is Longmont, and then the gray blob sort of in the center is Erie, and then below that is Louisville and Lafayette. So in the area of the Wattenberg field, there are, I don't know if you can tell on the map, but there are lots of little dots, and those represent the houses and the people that live there. And all told, there's about 3,000 houses in that area and about 7,000 people living there in about 45 different either subdivisions or what we call non-urban planned unit developments. We, as Kim and many others have said, we believe that those people deserve the same kinds of protections from large-scale facilities that others would get if they lived in slightly more dense areas.
Yes, I'm Erica Delaney-Liu from the City and County of Broomfield. I have to thank the commission for hearing us, and I have to thank my allies for letting me speak out of order. I have to leave here and immediately go to a Planning and Zoning Commission meeting in Broomfield. So we're going to jump around a little bit to accommodate me, and thank you for doing that. The point I want to talk about today is you're going to hear from our group. We've had a lot of discussions on this. We've had a lot of compromise and meeting of the minds on this, and what is serious is that the proposed definition of large UMA facility is not going to be adequate to local governments, and that's why we're here today. The part I'm here to talk about is that the definition needs to be definite. You have to close this incremental drilling loophole that's being created by the proposed rule. I'm calling it an incremental drilling loophole, but what I'm referring to is the fact that new and existing on-site storage capacity is worked into the definition, but only new well bores is being worked into the proposed definition. That's unacceptable because it really means that on existing sites, something slightly less than meeting this large definition can be added to that existing site without triggering the mitigation requirements of the large-scale facility, which really defeats the purpose of the rule. To protect against incremental drilling by operators to avoid this definition, it's imperative that either the cumulative measured depth of new and existing well bores be used, or a date by which new wells can be defined be included in the definition. Now, Adams County just suggested in their testimony that wells drilled within the last 5 years could meet that definition of new by means of, presumably, they're still producing. That seems to make a lot of sense. COGC staff has stated they chose this method of the combined wellbore length because it's objective, easy to determine and verify, and available early in the operator's planning or Form 2A application process. Those things are all true, and it's a definition that local governments can work with, but it needs to be definite, or it's not a definition. By the COGCC staff wellbore length analysis that was submitted earlier today in the exhibits, what this chart shows me is that there are more than 400 well sites that have 3, 4, and 5 wells on them. Without closing this incremental drilling loophole created by the proposed rule, each of those 400 sites with 3, 4, or 5 wells already on them could have 6 to 8 additional wells added at each site without meeting the definition of a large-scale facility. So it's too manipulable, it's not clear, and a definition, if anything, needs to be finite and clear.
Do we have any questions for Ms. Delaney before she goes and plans? Your city and county has some kind of MOU with operators, is that?
We do have an MOU with one operator, and we have revised our regulations. We look to be using that more in the future. And like I've said, we've done a lot of work communicating with this group of governments. We're uniquely situated in that we're a city and county. But that being said, we also understand and will argue for the perspective of local governments, even if it's something that doesn't technically apply to a city and county. So,
how's that MOU working out in your judgment?
In our jurisdiction, we have not had an application come in yet under the MOU. We've had some applications, but they're still in the planning phase, so we haven't.
Just yell at me. You're about done.
We haven't had any drilling actually occur under the MOU yet, and the operator Sovereign has sold their interests to a company named Extraction, who has already come in and met with us about proceeding under the MOU eventually.
Thank you. Okay.
Good evening. My name is Greg George. I'm the Director of the Development Services Department for the City of Loveland. I think I'm going to address an issue that really hasn't been brought up today, and it's very simple. First of all, I'd like to thank the commission for letting me represent the city of Loveland here. They also kind of squeezed me in, so I wouldn't have to drive back tomorrow morning in probably a foot of snow on I-25. I also want to make it clear that the city of Loveland agrees with the positions of the other members of our group, but I wanted to address this one particular issue that is very important to the city of Loveland, and it's fairly simple. All we're asking for is you to expand the consultation area, which to us seems to be the backbone for how the whole oil and gas rules work. It's a process of consultation, trying to reach agreement. We understand, and we recently adopted our own ordinance that certainly applies within our city limits. But one of the most important areas facing Loveland today is our growth management area. It's along the 402 corridor. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's in Larimer County. We have an IGA with Larimer County that gives the city of Loveland some authority over land use. And what I want to talk about today is your definition of local government with land use authority. We would like you to expand that just for consultation purposes to include a local government that has land use authority within a growth management area with a county, which the city of Loveland does. Under the Colorado Local Government Land Use Control Enabling Act, which is at section 2920-101 of the Colorado Revised Statutes, local governments are authorized and encouraged to cooperate and actually contract with one another for the purpose of planning and regulating the development of land. The legal instrument for accomplishing this sharing of authority is an intergovernmental agreement. I'll refer to that as an IGA as I go on. The grant of authority necessary for such agreements is found in the Colorado Constitution and state statutes. Local governments and counties commonly use an IGA to share land use authorities within areas designated on a local government's comprehensive plan as a growth management area. Designation of a growth management area is one of the most important components of a comprehensive plan, identifying the area recognized by both the local government and the county as the area into which the local government plans to grow in the next 15 to 20 years. And that's certainly the case with our growth management area on our comprehensive master plan. The Loveland-Larimer County IGA grants Loveland certain authorities to regulate land use. The county, for example, cannot approve certain types of subdivisions or special review projects unless Loveland is first given an opportunity to annex the land. So you can see how that's a very important tool for Loveland to expand its urban boundaries. To be consistent with the Colorado Constitution and state statutes, proposed Rule 305A, local government notification and consultation for large UMA facilities, should be revised to include within the term local government with land use authority granted to a local government by another local government, which in our case is Larimer County. With respect to our agreement with Larimer County, this affects our growth management area, which is an important part of our comprehensive plan. I wanted to address now quickly the urban mitigation area, the concept of that. Relying on the definition of a UMA as the only trigger to require that a local government with land use authority be included in consultation with the operator and the director is ineffective, particularly with respect to land within a growth management area. The area within a GMA is generally rural in character and therefore unlikely to contain enough building units within 1,000 feet of a proposed oil and gas facility to require consultation with the local government. The ineffectiveness of using an urban mitigation area as the criteria for requiring local government consultation is another reason why proposed Rule 305A should be revised to expand the notification and consultation requirements to areas within a local government's growth management area. As stated earlier, authority for a local government to participate in land use decisions within a growth management area is set forth in the Colorado Constitution and state statutes. The location of oil and gas surface development within a local government's GMA has the potential to create conflicts in land use that could infringe on private property rights, both for surface owners and mineral right owners. One of the primary objectives of the Larimer County Loveland Joint Planning Project within the Highway 402 corridor, which is our growth management area, is to regulate land use together with the county so owners of mineral rights and surface rights can achieve maximum benefit. The strategy to accomplish this objective is twofold. First, to reserve the land adjacent to the corridor for urban development in accordance with Loveland's comprehensive plan future land use map. And second, to site oil and gas surface development in areas outside the urban corridor. With horizontal drilling technology, oil and gas operators should still be able to reach oil and gas reserves under the urban corridor. For the reasons stated herein, the area within which the requirements in Series 300 rules should not be limited to urban mitigation areas, but should be expanded to include areas within a local government's GMA. Local governments should be given an opportunity to participate in the consultation process for determining the location of oil and gas surface development within their growth management area. The commission director should give local government recommendations on location the highest priority. Their operators should be required to provide material and substantive reasons why the location preferred by the local government is not technically or economically feasible. I'll conclude by saying that the red line version of the most recent version of the commission's draft rules contains the revisions to that language that would accomplish what I just went over. So, thank you.
Any questions? In your growth management areas along the highway where you're protecting the mineral owners, you would put limits 1 mile on each side of the highway or whatever?
Yes.
Would be the limit of that growth management area?
Yes, we've identified the width of the corridor where we plan to develop, and we're planning our utilities to accommodate this kind of development. Stuff for jobs, land uses for jobs, commercial, retail, things like that, higher density housing. We're hoping that the 402 corridor turns out to be Harmony Road, which you find in Fort Collins. It's a very beneficial corridor for not only Fort Collins, but the region. And we hope that 402 will be that in 15 or 20 years. And so it's just the corridor, and then we would work with the property owners and the mineral rights owners to try to locate the surface development outside that corridor.
Thank you. Okay, I guess we're moving on to Todd.
We're back to the definition. So we thank you for accommodating Loveland's comments so they don't have to battle the weather tomorrow. I just hope I don't see pictures of him skiing on Facebook or something.
Me too, me too.
So returning to the definition, the second thing that we'd like to speak to is the Allied Local Government Group would like to amend this definition of large facility to appropriately account for the scale of the facility and its proximity to homes. This includes adopting a smaller proxy for what's large. Quite simply, we think that the thresholds are too big as proposed. We encourage you instead to square the definition up to meet most people's expectations about what constitutes a large facility in their neighborhood, tying this to and considering historical patterns and what they've seen in the area in Colorado's history. More importantly, the definition of what constitutes large facility should better account for its impacts on people. The Allied Local Government Group alternative rule cuts the threshold for classifying large in half to 45,000 feet of borehole length or 2,000 barrels of on-site storage, including produced water, which La Plata County will speak to in more detail. In addition to the impacts felt from the mere presence of a large facility, its enormous disturbance area, the number of wells, tanks, and equipment on that site, we agree that our constituents would also find that 6 weeks of 24/7 industrial level noise, activity, light, and truck traffic onto and off the site would have a significant impact on their lives, not to mention their quality of life. These are just some of the tangible impacts, not even the disputed ones, not to dismiss them, but things related to public health and air quality, et cetera. Sometimes it feels like we're in a position where citizens feel like their level of tolerance is being regulated instead of the impacts associated with these facilities. We don't regulate these things because we want to exercise our authority. We regulate because we are trying, oftentimes and sometimes desperately, to address the impacts that people are telling us that they feel. Therefore, we urge you to adopt a definition that will make sense to Colorado residents and give them some confidence that large facilities, which these provisions are simply setting a threshold for, would be scrutinized appropriately and cited and mitigated effectively.
Commissioner Benton.
Just quickly, a point of clarification, the notes that I have, the documents we were given show 3,000 barrels. You've changed that to 2,000.
Kim.
Sorry.
Commissioner Benton has a very important question for you.
Thank you. So the notes that I had your produced hydrocarbons, produced water said 3,000 barrels. You've changed that to 2.
Our original draft or suggested draft had 3,000, and once Commissioner Busher changed his to 2,000, we thought that was an appropriate proxy to go with.
Thank you.
Well.
Easily influenced.
Not very easily, actually.
Okay. Other questions? What do you think, Matt?
Margaret's going to go.
Good evening. I'm Margaret Brubaker. I'm the city attorney for Brighton. I'm here on behalf of Holly Prather, who's our community development director, who's busy in Brighton dealing with all our burgeoning planning opportunities there. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about zoning for every use imaginable, but oil and gas development. Brighton, like most Colorado cities, has a zoning and land use map that ensures that adjacent landowners are compatible with one another. In fact, the zones are typically transitioned from one to another to ensure compatibility. Industrial zone land is purposely not set next to residential land, for example. Typically, industrial uses are next to commercial, with transitions to mixed use to residential with mitigation if required. This is the city's zoning map. It's the result of thousands of staff and resident hours in hundreds of meetings and public hearings. The city of Brighton has 2 zoning maps. One is this one that you see here, and then there's also one that indicates the planned use development land uses. Any change to either of these maps starts with consultation between the applicant and the planning department and discussions regarding requirements for that particular zone district, and then requires at least 2 public hearings. It is these maps that set the core of planning for compatible land uses in Brighton. Buying a home in a residentially zoned area provides assurance that the area will remain residential. Residents do not expect to have a shopping center or a metalworks operation or a landfill in residentially zoned areas, nor do they expect large-scale oil and gas facilities next door. However, under certain circumstances, any local government has far more control over the location of a coffee shop than it does for a large-scale oil and gas facility. In effect, none of these colors means a thing when it comes to oil and gas development. The map might as well be blank. Brighton needs to have early notice when the opportunity to consult with the oil and gas operator before they apply to the COGCC for every new location within Brighton, not just in urban mitigation areas. Certainly, every notice for 4 or more wells within an urban mitigation area is appropriate. That number should be lowered to 2 if there will be on-site storage of oil. 4 wells is estimated by the COGCC to take at least 6 weeks of drilling and completion. 6 weeks of 24/7 industrial levels of noise is enough to justify the operator taking the time to consult and give the local government advance notice. The COGC has stated that even if the local government consultation process applied to all locations within an urban mitigation area, it would still only amount to 0.8% of all the oil and gas locations in the state of Colorado. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Did I get lost? Ms. Brubaker, what?
Yes, it is.
Yes, it is. I'm
You're
sorry.
right.
Thank you, thank you. I want to ask you a real quick question. You zone for carrots and celery farms, or do you have any?
We have an ag zone, yes.
Okay. I thought maybe you did. Okay, any other questions?
Because they're the best in the state, you know that.
I've heard that. Okay, Todd?
I think it's my turn now, yes. Todd Weaver for La Plata County, and of course, as part of the allied local governments. In our alternate proposed rule, we've asked the commission to include produced water storage tanks as part of the definition of a large-scale facility. Now, staff's proposed rule currently does not include produced water storage tanks, just produced hydrocarbon storage tanks. Now, in his stakeholder cover memo that was provided with the first draft of proposed rules, Director Lepore stated the reason for including on-site storage tanks as part of the metric for determining a large-scale facility. He mentioned this was because if they're not piped, they're serviced by trucks, which causes traffic impacts. They have the potential to emit methane and volatile organic compounds, and they also create visual impacts. But all three of those also apply to produced water storage tanks. If the produced water is not piped from an oil gas location, guess what? It has to be trucked out of there. They do create visual impacts. And if you take a look at the slide, could you tell me which ones produce hydrocarbons and which ones produce water? If I didn't know what they were, I couldn't tell you either. And I guarantee you an average citizen could not tell the difference of what was produced hydrocarbon and what was produced water. In the next slide, same thing here. Could you tell me which one contains produced water and which one contains produced hydrocarbons? Visually, I would say they're the same thing. Average citizen's not going to know the difference between the two. And again, go ahead to the third slide. Produced water storage tanks also have emissions. These are emission factors created by the Air Pollution Control Division of the CDPHE. And they apply statewide. So you can see, yes, they emit VOC, they emit benzene, and they emit N-hexane. So yes, they have air emissions as well. Now the industry has made a few cursory arguments about not including produced water storage tanks. They said, well, they're smaller, less numerous. I'll say the representative that said they're less numerous has never been to La Plata County, where produced water storage tanks outnumber produced hydrocarbon storage tanks by probably 1,000 to 1. I'll say in La Plata County, we have coal bed methane, and produced water storage tanks are the predominant storage tanks that we have in the county. So they are obviously of a concern for us. And I know that they are also throughout the state. We have to remember that this rule does not just apply to the Front Range. It applies statewide. So we need to take into consideration production methods across the entire state, not just in Juwa. They've also argued that, well, they have lower emissions, and the commission rarely receives complaints about them. I don't receive complaints because the citizen doesn't know the difference between a produced water storage tank and a produced hydrocarbon storage tank. They just see a storage tank. Regardless of these arguments, I mean, what they're missing is it fails to understand and address the cumulative impacts of large-scale facilities. And that's what this rule is really trying to capture, the large-scale cumulative impacts of these facilities. So why should we take a look at a hypothetical well pad that has, let's say, 6 storage tanks on it? 3 might happen to be produced water, 3 might happen to be produced hydrocarbons. It's the cumulative impact of all 6 of those tanks that needs to be considered. They all contribute to emissions. They all have truck traffic if it's not piped from there. And they all should have visual impacts. They all look very similar. And that's what the average citizen is going to look at. So by not including produced water tanks, the rule does not adequately capture all the cumulative impacts from a large-scale oil and gas facility. Thank you.
concludes our comments.
Any questions? Todd?
I have one.
Commissioner Walker.
Sorry, I'm the one that asked to leave at 5:30, so I can't believe I'm asking a question. Are you more concerned about the visual impact of the tanks or of the VOCs? You have to pick one. You can't say both.
Last time I checked, VOCs aren't visible. So it's actually all three. We're concerned about traffic impacts, we're concerned about visual impacts, and we're concerned about air emissions of all storage tanks, not just produced hydrocarbons versus produced water. It really is all three because, again, VOC emissions aren't visible unless you have a special camera.
I'm just trying to get a sense for your prioritization, because you did show the slides showing, the visible nature of the storage
Yes.
tanks. So I'm just trying to get a sense.
From the average citizen, I think the visual impact also allude to kind of a fear of air emissions. And that last slide was really about showing that, yes, there are emissions from produced water storage tanks. It just kind of emphasized that point, but really it's all three that we're concerned about.
Okay, thank you.
But I want to ask you a tangential question.
Sure.
Could a hypothetical, theoretical oil and gas company come into La Plata County and do much of anything without consulting you and your planning commission or your county commissioners?
No.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I have just one question.
Just
and
one?
I'm not sure who I need to address this to. I'm just looking at the definition of a large UMA facility or a large scale facility. And I see it's been struck through to be located in an urban mitigation area and replaced, well, maybe it's not replaced, designated setback location. So does that mean just a well within 500 feet? What is the designated setback location if it's not part of a UMA?
This is Matt Sura with Boulder County. A designated setback location is any home within 1,000 feet of a facility.
So but that's part of the definition of UMA.
No, that's a definition of setback. That's a defined term. And so the designated setback location is the buffer zone location is one of them. There's others,
Okay.
Including the UMA. It's even one home within 1,000 feet of a oil and gas facility.
All right, thank you.
That kind of remind me of one other question. I apologize. Are there any UMAs in La Plata County, or are there some areas that potentially could be?
Yes, I mean, there potentially could be on the fringes of the city of Durango, town of Bayfield, town of Ignacio, and of course, there are a number of rural schools in La Plata County that would trigger a UMA area if a facility would be located within 1,000. Sorry, I mean 1,000 feet. What is it? What's this? UMA trigger? It came as 500 feet.
I
Sorry.
think it's 1,000 feet.
Okay, 1,000
1,000
feet.
feet.
So one of the within a bio school would definitely trigger it as well.
Thank you. Okay. What do you think, Matt? Thank you all very much. We appreciate it. Now, we're really close to closing time, except, did you say Weld County was not going to speak today?
Correct.
Okay. So,
Here is the information I have. I understand from industry that their presentation on this topic will be 45 minutes, exclusive of commissioner questions. The other, countervailing challenging factors are the weather conditions. Clearly, if we had 80-degree sunny day, staying later may not be as much of a concern. At the same time, we all have to get back here in the morning, or many of us do. So that's the information that I have.
colleagues, I'm open. I don't mind staying. I have a nice warm bed just a couple hundred feet from here. So I don't mind staying, especially because tomorrow Commissioner Allward and I are leaving here at 5 minutes until 5 or thereabouts. So
That's optimistic. Can I think about it on the way to the bathroom?
Yeah, let's take a quick.
No.
No, let's go ahead and make a decision,
No.
then we'll do the
Yeah.
bathroom. You want to stay on here, industry? And we'll- Hush your mouth. How about what do you think? Commissioner Walker, you need to get home?
Yeah.
So we better go ahead and wrap it up and then
It's
we'll,
up to you. I would really like to hear industry, but I also want to give them the benefit of a fresh audience from the commission as well.
okay, that seems to be consensus. And after all, we still have December.
Chairman, you might make me cry.
Okay, then we will reconvene mañana at 9 o'clock, huh? 9 o'clock tomorrow. How?
Hey, Ken?